Good evening, and welcome to this very special conversation tonight. I'm Steve Millies, Professor of Public Theology and Director of the Bernardin Center at Catholic Theological Union, and it's my privilege to welcome you on behalf of everyone at CTU. Catholic Theological Union is a graduate school of theology and ministry located in Chicago's beautiful Hyde Park neighborhood, close to the University of Chicago and the shores of Lake Michigan. We have been training men for the priesthood and lay ministers for service to the church and the world since 1968. All of our courses and degrees are offered in person here and fully online. If you'd like to learn more about our offerings, about CTU, or about the programming we do at the Bernardin Center, please visit our website, www.ctu.edu, and you can learn how to follow us on social media there too. And now, let me introduce one of the remarkable people who study here at CTU, our moderator for this evening's discussion, Emily Davis, a student in our MDiv program. Emily.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Davis, and I am a student in the MDiv program, as Steve just said. I also teach full-time at DePaul College Prep, a local high school here in Chicago. And my undergraduate degree is in international studies. So our topic for this evening is very important to me, the intersection of faith and politics. Tonight, joining us for our conversation, we have three wonderful panelists who we're really grateful to have. So I'll begin with their introductions. First, we have Jason Blakely. Jason is an associate professor of political science at Pepperdine University. He has written extensively on political theory, political theology, and the social sciences. His most recent book, We Built Reality: How Social Science Infiltrated Culture, Politics, and Power, received accolades from luminaries like Charles Taylor, David Bentley Hart, and Bishop Robert Barron. He also writes regularly on politics and culture in popular venues like Commonweal, the Chronicle of Higher Education, America Magazine, and The Atlantic. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA from Vassar College. He's a senior fellow at the Nova Forum for Catholic Thought at the University of Southern California. Melissa Cedillo. Melissa was born and raised in California's Coachella Valley. She attended Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles, where she earned a BA in theological studies. After college, Melissa spent time in Washington, D.C. as a campaign associate for Faith in Public Life, working to defend the integrity of the 2020 census. Melissa then went on to complete an MTS at Harvard Divinity School, where she studied religion, ethics, and politics through a public policy lens. Melissa currently works at the National Catholic Reporter as the Latino Catholics Fellow. She is passionate about bridging the gap between progressive politics and religion in America. She is dedicated to learning about and advocating for preventative domestic violence policy, reproductive justice, immigration advocacy, pushing for prison divestment, and decarceration work. And then our final panelist, Mumbi Kagutha, was born and raised in Kenya and is a member of the Sisters of the Precious Blood. She's worked with many diverse, vulnerable populations, including stints with various UN agencies. Mumbi currently resides on the south side of Chicago, working as the organizing secretary for the Pan-African Catholic Theology and Pastoral Network. She also does consultancy work in the area of reconciliation for various organizations, including Jesuit Refugee Services. Mumbi is a prolific writer, contributing regularly to the Horizons column of Global Sisters Report, amongst other publications. And she's also an activist who regularly speaks on the topics of racism, creating equity in the church, and advocates for an end to abuse in the church and religious institutions. She is a certified executive coach and derives great joy in using these tools to accompany different people in achieving different goals. Mumbi graduated from Catholic Theological Union with a Master's of Arts in Justice Ministry and a certificate in pastoral ministry, in addition to her previous MBA in marketing. She's also trained in facilitating the circle process as a tool for dialogue. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We will begin in just a moment with each of our panelists giving us their view on our topic for this evening from their specific kind of location within academia and public life. But before I do that, I just want to remind everyone tonight to be aware of their mute and unmute. So to try to stay muted while our speakers are speaking, and then to please put any questions in the chat. The second half of our time together will be focused around your questions. We want this to be a dialogue with each of you. And so if you could place them in the chat, we'll be sure to collect them and pose some for our panelists during the second half of our program. So without further ado, we'll open it up to our panelists. Jason, if we can begin with you, could you speak a little bit on your work on ideology and its role in public discourse, especially as this pertains to people of faith?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Emily, so much for the invitation. And I'm really happy to be here with my panelists who are very impressive people. So I've been working on ideologies for a while now, teaching on them, and I just want to make very brief remarks in the 10 minutes allotted to me. These derive from a book I've been working on ideologies, and I want to throw kind of a $10,000 philosophy word at you, which is hermeneutics. It's a word that basically encapsulates the thesis that human life is composed of meanings, thick meanings, and that humans are meaning makers. And that might seem a relatively straightforward thesis, but I think it's crucially important and actually very underappreciated for approaching and understanding ideologies and what they are. One way to look at what our problem is with ideologies at the moment is to think of it, or one way I like to think of it is the problem of reductive accounts of ideology, because when we talk about ideology, people assume already that they know what is meant by ideology. So person on the street might think, oh yeah, ideology, I know what that means. That means a sort of deranged, excessive, immoderate set of political convictions that someone has. And so there's a tendency to want to reduce ideology to kind of an irrational trigger that some people have. And on that view, there are people who have ideology and there are people who don't have ideology. And ideology is just something like false consciousness or poorly held political beliefs. On the other hand, there are also social scientists who give kind of reductive accounts of ideology and tell us that ideology might be a non-rational trigger. These get pretty complicated. I don't have time to go into them, but just very briefly to flick at a few of them, like the idea, for instance, that the ideological beliefs you hold is the result of a location in a particular economic structure. Or to put it in plainer language, well, you have the ideology you have because the class that you belong to. Or the thesis that ideology reflects your demographics. Well, you just hold those beliefs because you're, rich. You hold those beliefs because you're poor. You hold those beliefs because you're a woman. You hold those beliefs because you're white, because you're black. These are sort of reductive accounts of ideology, right, to some kind of irrational trigger. Now, there's a lot that I think is wrong with this sort of reductive definition of ideology that hermeneutics can help us with. I don't have time to go into it. But just one very clear problem with these definitions, or at least puzzle around them, is that it clashes with the self-understandings of people who hold ideologies. No one says, well, I happen to have this ideology because I'm just really deranged and immoderate in my political beliefs. Or, yeah, I vote this way because I occupy this location in a social or economic structure. That's where hermeneutics can really help us, I think, because hermeneutics has this thesis that we're meaning makers and that we're storytelling creatures. And so the hermeneutic definition of ideology is that ideologies are narratives, big stories that we live out within traditions. Ideologies might include a lot of things. They might get sharpened into sort of very sophisticated philosophical accounts or theories of economics, sociological theories, but they also include tropes and artwork, practices, rituals, ways of wearing your clothes, ways of presenting yourself. So ideology is very analogous in some ways to religious traditions or to cultural practices. They're kind of cultural maps or orienting geographies, if you like, on the hermeneutic view. They're meanings that we collectively create within traditions in order to sort of orient us towards some vision of a good society. That's what differentiates them from religions. Religions may or may not have some position on what a good society is. Ideologies orient us toward the articulation of some vision of an ordered or just society, or a society that has been properly configured by some vision of what's good, by some vision of how life ought to be run and governed. And in that sense, everyone has an ideology, and we live in an age of ideologies. And in that narrative sense that I ascribe to and that I think is so important, this kind of cultural approach to ideology, this storytelling approach, part of what you have to do in order to really understand ideology is to listen to people. And that listening to people does not mean being a relativist, on my view. It does not mean that everything is subjective. It does not mean that I accept everything you're saying, or that what you're saying I don't think is maybe wrong or even evil or wicked. It just means that I haven't even made the proper first move yet if I haven't really soaked in your story, and I can't recreate it in a way that you might recognize as your own. And I think one of the big problems we have right now in American society is that people do the reductive move on each other instead. They say, well, of course, look at you. I knew you were going to have that ideology. I knew that already. Or you're so deranged that I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not going to understand how you came to occupy this story. If instead we approached ideologies on the analogy to religious traditions, cultural traditions, we'd have to understand that people can convert in and out of ideological traditions. And in fact, they do. It's rarer and rarer in the United States because of the extreme polarization. So people tend to occupy the same ideologies their entire lives. But in fact, you can move across ideological traditions. You can get recruited into a story or narrative set of rituals and practices, and people do, in fact, move across the ideological traditions at different times in their lives. Some people do in any case. And so the first thing I would say in terms of what are ideologies is that ideologies are this strange epoch. They define this strange epoch we live in which people theorize and collect visions of the good that they then try to mobilize around. There's a kind of very modern element to it. We try to mobilize people to these. We try to recruit people to our visions. And then we try world making. We try to make a society based on our ideology. And all ideologies are a form of world making. They're not just simply descriptive. They have descriptive elements to them, but they in fact try to enact and try to create a sort of a world. And once you view ideologies that way, I think that hermeneutics implies a kind of what you could call, again, to use sort of a big philosophical word, epistemic humility, but a humility about human knowledge. Meaning, what I mean by that is, if there really are these like kind of big stories that carry a lot with them, rituals, customs, philosophical beliefs, artwork, etc. They're thick with meanings in this way. There's no silver bullet by which you can get rid of someone's ideology. Now, that might not mean that we might not find someone's ideology repugnant. I do find some ideologies very off-putting. It just means that the humility part is, just like with a religious tradition, there's not that one argument that, takes down, say, the Christian tradition, because you can always, find the theologian who's working on that problem, find some solution to it, or draws on these resources, or reinterprets the meanings this way. That's what ideologies are like, and that's why they don't go away, which has been a real big kind of scandal, I think, to people living the last 5 years. That ideology was supposed to go away. Socialism was supposed to go away. Ultranationalism and authoritarianism were supposed to go away. They didn't go away. Why didn't they go away? Now people are thinking, liberalism's supposed to go away. None of these are going to just go away in any real simple way. It doesn't mean that they're eternal features of the social world, far from it, but it means that they have resources by which they can reconstruct themselves, and there's not the single proof you can get rid of them with. So I think one thing about this approach to ideologies is it recommends a certain humility and a stance of dialogue. Dialogue just to understand, humility because as these big narratives, you can't get rid of them by a single argument or by a reductive move. You just hold that belief because you're irrational. And I think hermeneutics also, sort of wrapping up here, because I want to make sure we have enough time for dialogue and for my other panelists as well to weigh in on their own point of view on ideologies. But I think that hermeneutics implies a kind of sympathy or empathy with human beings, because we all face the sort of same story or meaning-making predicament. People don't like to be in this space for very long, but the fact of the matter is that the political and social world is very confusing. It's very vexing, it's frustrating, it's foggy, it's opaque to us. Sometimes it's clear, other times it's not. Why what's happening is happening and swirling around us. Why a certain person we love believes the things that they believe. And I think that this kind of approach recommends that one of the ways that to the horizon of ideology. I don't know that we can get out of ideology, because if ideologies are defined in this way, we all have ideologies, and we need ideologies in a sense to guide us and to orient us toward political and social life. But the humbling thing is to sort of recognize the anthropological conundrum there, which is, as Augustine says, I've become a question to myself, that we live these questions, we try to formulate stories to them collectively, within different traditions. And so if on the hermeneutic view, if there's any space outside of ideology, it might be the anthropological or existential recognition that you're always encountering other meaning makers like you. No matter how noxious their ideology might be, you are encountering another human being that's making an effort at meaning making and orientation within political life, and has been recruited into some vision of the good, whether we think that vision of the good has gone way off the rails or not. So I wanted to end with this, and I didn't, just to be respectful of the time, but, there's so much more that could be said, and that's just barely scratching the surface. But I want to end with this little phrase from Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet, because in his lecture number 4, which is this just absolutely mind-blowing poem that people can look up if they're so interested, he ends the poem by saying, oh, well, the only thing I place against necessity, law, and theory, the only thing I place against necessity, law, and theory is the pulsating heart, he calls it, of this little librarian he knew who was crushed under a bombed building. And he says, the only thing I put up against law, theory, necessity is this one pulsating heart of this one woman who everyone has forgotten. To me, the great danger of an ideological age is we lose the human horizon, and we lose the ability to encounter and dialogue, have what Pope Francis calls social friendship, because there's nothing left over from our ideologies. Our ideologies swallow the entire world, and there's no perception of some shared journey, no matter how strange and conflictual it might be, in being human. And I guess I'm trying to suggest that shared journey is a journey of puzzlement and recruitment and desire around meanings, and that we all share that space, even if we come to very different answers about that.
Thank you, Jason. I'm grateful for the way that you have neutralized ideology for us a little bit. I think that it helps us to set that as we move forward, to even think towards how can we maybe be thinking around how ideology is crafted as people of faith, and what are some of those markers of a faith ideology, and what does that then look like to practice as the missionary disciples that Pope Francis is asking us to be. So thank you for kind of laying our groundwork. Melissa, if you could indulge us next. In your time with NCR, you witness a lot of the social dialogue in the church, in political life, especially with your background. How do you see ideology playing out, both maybe as a hindrance to some of this like working together, solidarity movement, or even as a benefit to those things? Oh, also, sorry, before you begin, if everyone could remember to put questions in the chat too, as we keep going, so that we can have a fruitful dialogue on the second part of our evening. Thanks, Melissa. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
You're fine. Thanks, Emily. As a reporter, 10 minutes is a lot. I usually do the listening and have word limits. So thank you for what seems like an eternal amount of time. Kind of drawing on Jason's point, of friendship and social friendship, what I really admire about Pope Francis is the amount of time the words friendship is said when he talks about politics. I think it's really easy to think about it of like, yeah, my friends that I associate with have the same politics as me, but it's a little bit more difficult to think about what are the friendship, like how do my politics allow me to make friends? And so I think for me, if Jason really worked on the definition or undefinition, so to say, of ideology, what I reflect on, I think a lot as a journalist and a reporter who's trying to accurately capture stories that are being told, our feelings. So the reflection questions that I often ask or are in conversation about are, what does your ideology make you feel? Does it spark a sense of fear? Does it spark a sense of scarcity, that there's not enough? Or does it spark a sense of hope and abundance and that there's enough to share? And I think while there are many ideologies, these are all speaking to human emotions that have been timeless. I think, like Jason's saying, they've been around for a long time, just like the sense of fear and hope and desire and community have been around for a long time. So I think first and foremost, that's what comes up when I'm talking to folks about the current situation, not just in the nation, but globally. I think the other thing I can really speak to is that, talking to folks who identify as either Gen Z or millennial, sometimes there's this brand of, well, they don't make sense. They don't fit into an ideology. We don't know what to do with them. And I don't think that comes from a sense of being apolitical. I don't think that comes from a sense of not caring, but actually I think it comes from this idea that they're realizing very early on is that you don't fit perfectly into anything. And so if you want to be a Catholic who also votes in electoral politics while attending a university and fighting for fill in the blank, like you're already at odds, all of your identities are already at odds, right? And I think that this is something that the generation that I either am from or working with is really wrestling with, especially if you look at some of the stats of trust in institution is going down among my generation. It's really easy to write that off as, well, there's no ideology, there's no sense of commitment, there's no sense of community. And it's a lot harder to say it's coming from this idea that there isn't this perfect ideology and there's a lot of questions and there's a need for something that is not necessarily different from the past, but something that is really responsive and adaptive to the signs of the times that are happening now. And then I think the third point that I would probably make around ideology is around Pope Francis's Let Us Dream. I think what I love about the reporter role is that I think a lot of people think about news and media and they think about darkness and despair. I mean, if you read any headlines today, they're not always full of hope. And also, whenever I get to cover breaking news or something going on, I am always talking with people who are people of faith who are already responding. They're not waiting to see how it's going to get worse or better. They're just already there. And I think that that's really important because it gives me hope. And it's not a romantic sense of hope of like, well, if we all just try our best, it's really this faith in action that almost transcends ideology, I would say. I think a lot of the folks that I interview when I'm getting background, I don't ask what is your ideology because I think it's much easier to capture based on their response, their work, and their commitments to their community. And I also think that, it's a word that's become sometimes weaponized, sometimes loaded. And so if I led with that, people might start policing how they answer questions that I have for them on sometimes really intimate, full conversations. And so those are my main points. Again, as a reporter, it's really hard to hit the 10-minute mark, but if anyone has questions for me about that, please feel free to insert them in the chat.
Thank you, Melissa. We appreciate your comments, even if you feel as though they're brief, they were rich. We're grateful to have, I think, you bring us into a more contextualized space in terms of, like thinking through the very real things like feelings and actions, and how that informs an ideology, as well as our ideologies kind of inform our actions and our feelings. So I'm grateful for that. Sister Mumbi, if you could share with us, you have done some work with the A Better Kind of Politics chapter of Fratelli Tutti. So you have some specific context to that chapter and what Pope Francis is calling the church to, the world to, in terms of what it means to be a social community, to be in solidarity with one another. Could you share a little bit about what this kind of looks like for you and some of the work that you've done?
So I have to confess that my bias in Fratelli Tutti is chapter 7, which I've done a lot of work on, but I've read all the other chapters just because I've been co-editing some other commentaries on the entire encyclical. So I come at it from a more reflective point of view now that I had to read it and make it my own. And I think that when we look at Pope Francis from the time he became the 266th successor of Peter, he has clearly demonstrated who he considers the people to be. You see that phrase coming about in chapter 5. In his travels around the world, he makes a point in each country to encounter those on the very margins, those who are very different from him, refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, peoples of other faiths, the incarcerated, the unhoused. We also see in his personal letter writing and his spontaneous calls how he has reached out to our LGBTQIA siblings and their allies, to a man grieving the murder of his brother, amongst many others. And we all saw that beautiful picture when he reached out to touch the feet of South Sudanese leaders, to appeal to them to find peace for their people. More so, he has repeated so many times that we should be a church of and for the poor. And I think it's a call for us to recognize our own poverty, no matter what trappings of success or wealth we may possess. This spiritual poverty that Ignatian spirituality emphasizes informs us of who Pope Francis is as a Jesuit in so many different ways. We are all called to this poverty of spirit, which is a stance of utter dependence upon God, recognizing that all we have and possess is gift, and thus freely choosing to offer it back to God for the service of our siblings in this world. And it is only in doing so that we also can be the people that Pope Francis refers to, united with every member of the human race in our shared identity. So I think it is with this in mind that Pope Francis condemns various ideologies that detract from this collective spirit and identity in so many different ways. Ideologies that claim to offer a solution to our various problems around the world. On one hand, we have liberalism, and more so economic neoliberalism, which puts individual interests, and more so those of the rich, before the needs of the whole, the majority. Then on the other hand, we have this ideology of populism, and in its various and often distorted forms, it exploits people, the people, by pitting them against the perceived elites, while in fact allowing those popular leaders to divide, conquer, and plunder the very same people they claim to lead while enriching themselves. And I will try and speak a little from an African perspective. This current state of the world that we are living with all the angst in it, did not just come about, but we arrived here because of thought processes and choices and decisions and conflict of values over a number of the past centuries. It is very easy to perceive what some of those thought processes entailed: racism, sexism, misogyny, a sense of superiority, of entitlement, a desire to dominate, to conquer, to be powerful. And such thought processes resulted in the slavery and colonization endeavors, not to mention violent efforts to recruit people into various religions and denominations in the name of missionary activity. It resulted in nations wanting to be declared the most powerful in the world at any cost. It resulted in erasures of cultures while promoting some, It created the first world versus the third world. It resulted in greed and selfishness, and has resulted in 1% of global households owning 43% of global wealth. And of that percentage, people of African heritage are minute, yet we know the contributions of Black and African people to global wealth through extractive and exploitive practices on their continent that continue to this day. Which then begets a question. When we say that Africa is the richest continent in our world, how come majority of those billionaires are not African? So I have a bias being African, living in America, and especially after the COVID pandemic and the resulting devastation and people sinking further into poverty. Yet in this same time, we have heard of individuals amounting wealth in amounts previously unprecedented. So with this in mind, it is imperative to understand that we cannot rely on individual philanthropy and charity to solve societal problems. And Pope Francis emphasizes this in this chapter. Because giving a percentage of one's profits, given from your surplus, can never balance out the inequalities and injustices that have resulted in very few possessing half of the resources of the world that are needed to provide basic human needs. There is a blurring between the identity or the person of politicians, those who are entrusted with caring for the needs of the people, the majority, with those who own the world, so to speak. It is difficult to tell them apart nowadays. But we also look to the church and see the same polarization. We see a blurring between secular values and what we stand for and with as a church. We are living in a time when Catholic social teaching principles are being dismissed in favor of picking and choosing scripture verses that without proper exegesis support our insular and biased views and allow us to reject, condemn, hate, and oppress the other. One only needs to wade into Catholic Twitter on any given day and be jarred at the vitriol being hurled about by people who identify as very devout Catholics. A common argument in politics and in society and in church to counter our shared responsibility for each other is often, why can't they fix their own countries, their own communities? If they weren't lazy, they wouldn't be poor. They should be content with whatever we give them, since beggars cannot be choosers. I will not go into the multiple fallacies that underlie such statements or the ignorance of historical and current knowledge that can explain why countries continue to become inhabitable due to poverty and violence, or why the pulling yourself up by the bootstraps is a false dream founded on neoliberalism. But I'll share the following quote by Paul Farmer, who has now joined the heavenly realm of our ancestors. He said, "There's nothing wrong with underlining personal agency, but there's something unfair about using personal responsibility as a basis for assigning blame, while simultaneously denying those who are being blamed the opportunity to exert agency in their lives." I will repeat. There is nothing wrong with underlining personal agency, but there is something unfair about using personal responsibility as a basis for assigning blame while simultaneously denying those who are being blamed the opportunity to exert agency in their lives. For a majority of the people around the world, their right to self-determination, self-agency, and their rights to human dignity have been taken away through these ideologies that are wielded by politicians and the rich according to what advantages them the most at that time. Robert Schreiter, another ancestor, said that Christ has to be more than a friend of the middle and upper classes. And this is what Pope Francis keeps hearkening to when he says he wants us to be a church for the poor. So what is the panacea for all this doom and gloom? A new mentality is required, a mentality rooted in the golden rule, in the commandment to love God and to love your neighbor as self. The commandment to love is not easy. And even Pope Francis mentions in this chapter that courage and generosity are needed in order to accomplish it. This chapter reminds us that personal freedom lies within the context of a shared humanity. that in caring for the welfare of each other, and in doing so, you find the greatest fulfillment. He reminds us that the top-down approach rarely works, as those at the top have no encounters with those at the bottom and cannot relate to their reality. Thus, bottom-up approaches rooted in solidarity need to be encouraged, with always a special eye towards the weak, lest we create new forms of exclusion. What I find Fratelli Tutti calling us Ubuntu, and I will end by paraphrasing another great ancestor, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He says, one of the sayings in our country, in South Africa, is Ubuntu, the essence of being human. Ubuntu speaks particularly about the fact that you can't exist as a human being in isolation. It speaks about our interconnectedness. We think of ourselves far too frequently as just individuals, separated from one another, whereas you're connected and what you do affects the whole world. When you do well, it spreads out. It is for the whole of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mumbi. I appreciate you bringing us to Pope Francis and really settling us into what it means to be a person of faith and leading with those words from our ancestors, as you said, who have inspired so many with their lives and continue to inspire us now. With that being said, we're going to open up to some Q&A. So I am going to pull some questions from the chat. Please keep inserting questions as they come up for you so that way we can continue this dialogue. Some questions I'll direct specifically to certain panelists. Other questions I might open up for each panelist to give a little bit of something for, depending on how we are going with time. But the first question I want us to maybe think about is one that is timing-wise very appropriate. And I was wondering if this is something for maybe each of our panelists, how we think about the Synod on synodality, right? And the role that might play in navigating, I think some of what I'm hearing from each of you is the need for human conversation, human contact. You know, and how do we feel maybe about the Synod and its role in that? So if we could just kind of jump in maybe one at a time to see who might have a thought first and then go from there. Jason, go ahead.
Oh, I'll leave that to the more theologically well-versed panelists. I should probably weigh in on synods. Yeah.
Mumbi or Melissa, do one of you want to take that one?
Could you repeat the question, Emily?
Sure. When it comes to the Synod and the Synod on synodality, you know, what is the role that might play in facilitating some of this, I think, need for human connection and encounter to come through, especially as it pertains to our ecclesial structures, you know, to our church and all that means.
I think there's a lot of potential for the Synod, at least from what I've read and what Pope Francis intended it to be. However, over the years, the hierarchical structure of the church, which was instituted to serve a need, I want to use good words, but the fact that bishops have so much power over their individual jurisdictions determines exactly how a synod comes to play in every particular diocese. So so this is a critique of that top-down approach. And actually, as I wrote that, I smiled thinking that Pope Francis sits at the very top of a very hierarchical structure and is advocating for a bottoms-up approach. So there's a lot of possibility in the synod, but as I mentioned, it goes back to those who are entrusted with sharing this synod process and inviting the people of God to take part in it as equals. And from what I've had, because I've asked many people, it's taking different forms and shape everywhere. And in some places, it's not happening at all. But when you think about the very basis, you use the word that this synod is supposed to promote encounter. That in sitting there and accepting that we are all church, irrespective of the position you hold in that church, whether ordained, vowed as myself, Eucharistic minister, or the Catholic who only comes for Easter and Christmas, lapsed or otherwise, and truly listening to one another and believing that the Spirit of God is present in each of those people, to understand where we are all coming from. In a church that is so divided, and I find especially more so in this part of the world, and recent events and Pope Francis's decision to kind of restrict the use of particular forms of the Mass has widened that division. But to truly listen to one another about where are we coming from? What informs your way of thinking, your way of faith? Why do you enjoy worshiping in that way more than the other? However, what we are called upon is to be a listening church, and the world and the ability to listen seems to diminish every single day. We listen with the need to respond, with the need to be right. We have stopped listening with the desire sometimes to agree to disagree, and know that that does not stop me and Melissa or Emily or Jason from being friends, that we can have different opinions, but respecting each other's value processes, but then going back to the magisterium and the teachings of the church and saying, what did God intend of us as his followers, as God's disciples? So the synod has a lot of potential, but what I'm seeing is that the synod process is most fruitful where it's being organized again from the bottom up, and their people are being allowed to send their statements straight back to the Vatican if you feel that the processes within your parish and diocese are not fulfilling or are not welcoming everybody. So lots of potential. Whether we shall reach it, God knows.
Thank you, Millie.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Melissa.
I was going to say, so one of the cool things about working at National Catholic Reporter is that I know that the synod is happening. And I know that seems very small, but like, as I was interviewing people this past week who are meeting with Pope Francis on Thursday. So on Thursday, Pope Francis is doing a video conference with students across the Americas, and they're university students from Canada, the Caribbean, South America, the US, different regions. A lot of the students said they did not know that it was a synod year until they were preparing for this or got asked to participate, and that even if they had known, they wouldn't have thought that they would be asked to dialogue. And so I think, just to even know that that's happening in the church is almost a sense of privilege and being plugged in. And that's not to say, therefore, don't do it. It's to say that if our duty as Catholics or our call is to go out and spread the good news, it means that when we find out this information, that we hear that the Pope is doing something that has, like you're saying, a lot of potential to do good, then we need to share it, and not with those who are just already plugged in. And so I think this specific idea that you're reaching out to university students, I know New Ways Ministry is doing an intentional reaching out to those who identify as LGBTQ to be heard. There's an intentional reaching out among women's ordination. People who are typically classified as not Catholic enough to participate in conversation are being reached out to. And I think as long as that continues in this listening process, that this bottom-up approach is being fixed on, stays at the root of it, that there is, like you're saying, a lot of potential for good. And I think the other thing that's been really interesting, NCR created this interactive map of showing where in the US, which diocese has announced that this is happening. In October, every priest or bishop given the diocese was supposed to announce it. And if you haven't, you can write and you can talk about it in the announcement process. The parish that I attend here in Washington, DC made sure that there were prayer cards on synodality in English and Spanish, which I found very intentional. I say all of that because I think that if your parish is doing this, if it's plugged in, if it's going well, there is almost a duty, a responsibility to make sure that the parishes around you are also plugged in, and that we don't maybe restrain it to those who are only the perfect definition of Catholic. Not that that even exist. I'm sure Jason, like you're saying with like ideology being reduced, like saying reduced, saying the perfect Catholic could be very reduced as well. But all that to say, I think that this presents a really unique opportunity. And I think it is really cool to be alive at a time that something historic like this is happening. And I think it really has this spirit of hope and optimism, and a drawing back to a lot of people who have otherwise decided they don't want to be part of the church or would not come back, but are being invited in a way that fully recognizes their dignity.
Thank you. I'm turning our conversation maybe a little bit, but I'm curious, I guess, about the relationship between, like we are talking about the church and we are talking about a teaching institution with a moral imperative. And so we have a certain movement that's occurring. And how does that work when it comes to constructing ideology? Is there a such thing as a Catholic ideology? How do we think along those lines? And what might that mean? I think what we're hearing so far, like, it is great that we have this synodal process where we are going to have all of these voices together, hopefully working through dialogue, which is what we're hoping for. But what does it mean to be in this space where this is the Catholic Church? This is a teaching institution. And what does that look like? And I think there also might be parallels between, other institutions and ideologies. So I think there's lots of ways that maybe this question could be approached, but I'm curious about maybe where each of you might be falling on that.
Well, I think that, the church remains a challenge to and provocation to all ideological positions without being subsumable in any one. Obviously they're Catholic social teaching. It's probably a lot easier, kind of like negative theology, to do negative political theology. Like, what can you not be? You can't be racist. You can't be, like some kind of ultra ethnic nationalist. They're things that just don't fit the church's teachings. But are there versions of a lot of different ideologies that might survive, critical processing through the church? Yes. And then also there's the whole issue that the church kind of leaves to our freedom in history as a kind of like path that the church itself, Jesus did not arrive with a ideological blueprint. He is always speaking in parables that have political language to them, very political language. My kingdom is, one in which you get paid, even though you came in the last hour, you get paid as much as the first workers who showed up. And so there's also these kind of mind-blowing stories about what his kingdom is like, at the same time that he doesn't establish a polity. He does not establish a set of, like a positive, like a set of laws. And so there's always been this kind of puzzle of human initiative, and the church itself, in its earthly form, the people who compose the church here right now, being put in the humbling position of not knowing exactly what a Christian politics is, at the same time that we're doomed to, like, we're asked urgently to respond. So it's both. I don't actually fully know, and I must act. I must think. I must repair, wounds. I must. So I think that that's always been sort of the space of tension. I guess I'm very troubled right now by things like Catholic integralism that seem to try to make too tight a fit, I would say, between Catholic magisterial teaching and a particular ideology. Not that certain things they're advocating might not still be on the table, just not the way they're being presented, I would say, as having such a tight fit with magisterial, teaching.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it raises there are a lot of, I think, tensions at play that we are having to balance. And I think that's part of maybe the greatness of the Catholic both and. It's complicated. We're trying to, I think, wade into this water, knowing that there is that moral imperative, even if we're unclear sometimes on what it means. And I think that the dialogue and action, these are spaces that are always being worked out. We are getting kind of close to the top of the hour in our time. With that, though, I was hoping that maybe we could close on a note of hope. And so I'd love to hear from maybe each of our panelists. What do you see as hope for this conversation? You know, I think what are the ways in which I think ideology can bring us into community, can help us to maybe even place language, you know, things like that. What do you see as the hope in terms of a better kind of politics, both for our world and our church?
Did you want someone to start, Emily?
Yes, please.
Who did you want to start?
Oh, I don't have anyone. Jason,
Okay.
If you want to go ahead, please.
Yeah, Zoom makes this kind of awkwardness where no one goes first. But yeah, so a hopeful note, I guess, would just be that, well, you know, I saw in the chat, people are asking, how do you decide between ideologies and whatnot? And certainly one thing to keep in mind is that, you know, you can assess always a story on its own terms. Does the story work well on its own terms? Like Mumbi was talking about neoliberal ideology. You know, certain formulas, certain policies were suggested that were supposed to lead to certain outcomes, you know, wealth outcomes, what have you. If your own agenda is sort of foiled, or, you know, to pick another example, if like revolutionary action in order to dissolve the bourgeois state always ends up in some kind of thing that doesn't quite look like what you want, then maybe you don't have quite the right story. I mean, and maybe you can rework your story. But so one thing I find hopeful very much in Pope Francis is an ethic of accompaniment and listening, because the only replacement for a bad story, in my view, is a better story. And a better story is one that is less self-contradictory, helps orient you more into life, but it's a dialogical thing. Like I said, there's not going to be one, kind of like with religion, you almost have to try it from the inside, you know, and see how it fits. So the hopeful thing I would say coming out of Pope Francis is this call for social friendship, this call to accompany people and to stay with them, not to expect I've got the one argument and now you're going to have to be a liberal or a socialist or an integralist or a conservative or a Trumpist. There is no such argument. The question is, do I love the other person? And the problem is that ideology in its bad form swallows our whole perceptual apparatus and we don't see a person there anymore. And I think that's what really concerns Pope Francis. And I had my own way at that with hermeneutics, which is there any human remainder outside of ideology, or does ideology swallow the whole world so that even if I need it, even if it's necessary, even if I can't evade it, I don't see people anymore. And I guess the note of hope for me is, and it's more of a question, is how do I learn to accompany and stay with others, even as the beliefs I have in my head, the map of meaning that's orienting me isn't the one that they have? Or do I just retreat into the group that everyone has the same story that I do, so that I feel more comfortable? I think Pope Francis is very clearly and strongly against that, and is about finding modes. And there's so many of those modes, right? Meditation, prayer, you know, feeding people, listening to them, playing songs together. There are so many ways, but spaces of dialogue and of encounter, like he keeps saying. So I guess I would say that that would be my cautious hope, is for some kind of human accompaniment in this moment.
Thank you, Jason. Mumbi or Melissa?
Mumbi, would you like to go? I know we only have
I think when I hear ideology, I hear another attempt to try and box everything up and make it all neat. And I think it's a human desire. We like a certain sense of predictability. But I think there's a danger in that, because then we are not open to the Holy Spirit inspiring us and changing. Life is dynamic, people are dynamic. And when I even think of social categories, new categories I imagine each time of people who are excluded or included, or who's in the in group or the out group. So I go back and as a Catholic, I look to Catholic social teaching, which was developed over years. And I think in it, I can find a principle that helps me be like the moral scale balance when faced with issues that are beyond my understanding, and see, is this pushing me to be fearful and go towards myself, or is it helping me reach out? We are creating binaries in the world, and I think it's leading to our destruction. And it's how we even project onto other people. And we need to ask ourselves, at that time of reflection, of prayer, because Pope Francis also reiterates, and Robert Schreiter used to say it all the time, you cannot be a minister of reconciliation without having a fruitful prayer life. You have to be deeply rooted in God, because it's in God that you find that capacity to love and extend yourself to those whom you feel you have nothing in common, to those you perceive as enemies, to those you perceive as people who would want to harm you. And without naming groups of people, we all have those people in our lives. Because with social media, the filters that used to exist in human life have dissipated. And people put out their first thought without filtering, without thinking. So you know where people stand. And sometimes you're meeting people whom you already know where the political or religious stand is. What would happen if we were willing to give up something? This is the spiritual poverty. To trust that we don't know it all, we don't have the perfect answer, no matter how good of a Catholic I might be. And trust that the Holy Spirit is present in everybody because the breath of God lives in them, and that they have something that they can teach you, that there are values that you can share, even if your ideologies are so different. But it requires us to inhabit a space of vulnerability, which is very difficult in this world, but it's possible. And so whether it's prayer or whether it's meditation, to know that your dignity is not dependent on people's judgments or ideas of you. And in that place, you can find the ability to let go of some of your belief systems so that you can learn something, and together we can experience this shared humanity.
Thank you,
Melissa. Did you want me to go? I know we're at
Melissa, if you have something brief you'd like to share, please.
Okay, I guess I will do my Jesuit education proud, but the quote that comes to me is from Romero, and I'm going to butcher it, but it is to never get tired of preaching love. And I know that sounds, I think, sometimes so silly given the headlines that are out there. But I was just talking to my friend who immigrated here from the Soviet Union, and their dialogue was essentially, I don't agree with Putin. And also, when the US sanctions Russia to protect the Ukrainians as they should, I will not be able to Skype with my family any longer because it will affect the electricity there. And I think, without getting into bigger topics of capitalism and militarization and all of that, my hope for Catholics is whatever room you're in, whether it's the State Department or your parish or diplomatic conversations, it is that you are preaching love, and not a romanticized love where we're all friends no matter what, but a love that says when you sanction someone, when you have a policy, even if you're doing it to protect other folks, that there are still humans on the other side of that sanction who are probably facing the consequences of something that they didn't even have a say in, right? And so I think what gives me hope is the people who look at the state of the world and, despite all odds, choose not a false hope, but almost, as Octavia Butler says, a science fiction type of hope, of looking to a world that does not yet exist and still fighting for it anyway. And I think that as Catholics is our goal when it comes to politics, is to make people think about the kingdom on earth in a way that we haven't before, while taking the reality as it is.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa. I really appreciate that kind of wonder that we might use to approach this topic, looking out on the world and at one another with this sense of like wonder and goodness. and leading, I think, with a curiosity for encounter and dialogue and relationship, so that we can meet each other in exactly as we are, right? The human beings that we are, and hopefully together actualize the kingdom, actualize the goodness that God is calling us towards. So we are at time, but I am so grateful for each of the panelists. I'm grateful for you all accepting my invitation and being here tonight to share your wisdom, as well as to all of our guests this evening for your questions, your attention, and your engagement. This is a big topic, I think, that we only scratch the surface of, but I think it's so important that we all are gathering and at least initiating that conversation. You know, even this space tonight is a place for encounter and dialogue. And these are some of the ways, you know, we continually answer that call. And so I'm grateful for that. Steve, I'm not sure if you need me to say anything more, or if there's any announcements from the Bernardin Center for our audience.
We are grateful for everybody being here with us tonight. I'm tremendously grateful for what's been a very rich conversation, as I'm grateful to Emily, who has put this whole project together from beginning to end as part of her ministry practicum here. A very unusual kind of project here at CTU, but one I think that has borne fruit. So that's it for us, everybody. Give your thanks, please, to Jasa, Melissa, to Lumbi, and certainly also to Emily Davis. Stay healthy, and we'll hope to see you all again really, really soon.